Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we are discussing Parliament at 60. Last lecture, we discussed about various aspects of Parliament, its functioning, and we also talked historical perspective, how it evolved over the years. And we concluded the lecture on whether we should adopt a presidential form of governance or the we are having like parliamentary form of governments. So, and a good deal of argument we made yesterday. We will move further from there, and we'll talk about interlocking of union and state legislature, and we'll also discuss the parliamentary process, parliamentary committee, and recently the role of media has very become significant in all aspects. So, how the parliament and media relations are dominating over the situations, and we'll also talk about the citizens' participations in the parliamentary process. And for discussion on this very topic, we have the same resource person, Dr. M.P. Singh. He is a renowned scholar of political science. His work on comparative politics has been widely appreciated. The work on federalism, we have also seen the book and discussed on this book on federalism. So you all know the how the federalism works. So in India, and it is a very soul of our democratic success in India. And there are other issues like which we are all confronting every day, the challenges from the different quarters. So everything which needs to be discussed in relation to the Parliament at 60, we will try to cover. But in 1 hour it is not possible to cover in detail. So briefly, we'll try to just have a look on those issues. And for discussion, we welcome Professor M.P. Singh for the lecture on this very topic. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Amarendra. In yesterday's lecture, we tried to discuss some aspects of the Parliament, and in the continuing discussion today, we would move on to discuss some other aspects that need to be taken into account to evaluate the Indian Parliament at 60. One aspect that I would like to draw your attention to is interlocking between the Parliament and the state legislatures. The legislative branches are the most important organs of parliamentary democracy because they are directly elected by the people, particularly the chambers that are directly elected by the people. They are the repository of democratic representativeness and democratic accountability. The interlocking of the Parliament and state legislatures is an aspect which the Indian Constitution has very diligently worked out. There are 3 lists in the 7th schedule of the Constitution, the Union list, state list, and the concurrent list. We discussed them briefly yesterday. That was the point at which the lecture concluded yesterday. Today, we would move on to bring in some other aspects of this phenomenon. The Parliament of India legislates on the union jurisdiction, subjects in the union list and the concurrent lists. But the Parliament can also legislate on a state list under certain circumstances. One circumstance is if a number of state legislatures or governments request the Parliament to make law for them. So, if a state governments backed by their legislatures request the Parliament of India to make laws on certain state list subjects which are exclusive jurisdiction of the states, the Parliament can make law, but such laws cannot be repealed by the state legislatures. If the state if the law is to be repealed, the Parliament can again proceed with the repealing of the act, and the state legislatures that requested the Parliament to make the law cannot unilaterally repeal those laws. There is another situation in which the Parliament of India can legislate on state subjects. For instance, if an emergency is declared, if a constitutional emergency is declared under Article 356, the constitutional idea is that if the government of a state is not being carried out according to the provisions of the Constitution, or in other words, if the constitutional machinery has broken down in a state, the government of India, the President of India, can take over the administration of that state. Now, in the period of emergency, under Article 356, the Parliament legislates on the state subjects for the state in which emergency is applied. In addition, there are other aspects that affect the federal as well as state governments. Parliament can intervene. For example, if there is a new All India service to be created, in addition to the Indian Administrative Service, Indian Police Service, and Indian Forest Service. These are three All India services which are unique bureaucratic structures in comparative government, in comparative federalism, because in no other federal system we have that kind of civil service that is shared by both orders of government. Other federal systems have central civil services or federal civil services, state civil services, local civil services, the three categories of services. All these three categories are present in our country as well, but in addition to these three central services, state services, and local services, local government services, we also have an all India service, the three services that I just mentioned, and they are shared by both orders of government in the sense that highest echelons or highest rungs of bureaucratic posts, administrative positions in the union government as well as in state governments are manned by or operated or functioned by these all India services. So if a new all India service is to be created, the Constitution has given this authority to the Rajya Sabha, the Council of States, because the Council of States is the federal second chamber and it represents the regions or the state governments or the states. The people of the state and the governments of the states are represented in the Rajya Sabha. And all India services are shared by both federal and state governments, and therefore it is only the Rajya Sabha that has been constitutionally empowered to pass a resolution by 2/3 majority to set up a new all India service. Now, we have a state-centric devolutionary framework for local governments. Local governments, as I pointed out yesterday, is a state jurisdiction. Under the Constitution, it is a state subject. The 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments have added two new schedules to the Constitution, the 11th schedule and the 12th schedule. The 11th schedule enumerates or lists the subjects on which the panchayat can act, panchayat can operate. So the jurisdiction of the panchayats are marked out in the 11th schedule of the Constitution, and the 12th schedule of the Constitution lists the subjects of municipal jurisdiction. Municipal corporations, the urban city councils, have their own jurisdiction, and these are marked out in the 12th schedule of the Constitution. Now, this part of the Constitution is devolutionary rather than federal. Federal theory or the federal concept is applicable only to the union and the state governments, and federal and state lawmaking are exclusive jurisdictions of the parliament and state legislatures, and local self-government legislation and executive action are created by state laws. Panchayati Raj Acts or municipal acts are enacted or passed by state legislatures, under which the municipal corporations and the Panchayat Raj bodies operate. Now, I'm trying to bring in the entire spectrum of parliamentary federal governance in India in this lecture, because that is if we exclusively focus on the parliament, we cannot get the entire constitutional spectrum and the complex interrelationships between the parliament and state legislatures. And that is the reason I have tried to bring here the broader picture in the process of discussion. The larger picture of the interface between parliamentarism and federalism has become especially important since 1989 Lok Sabha elections. Before that, there was one party dominance in the country. The Indian National Congress operated the federal government, controlled the federal government, and it also had a significant hold on a large number of state governments. So during one party dominance, during the phase of one party dominance, about which we will discuss later a bit more, but here it would suffice to state that the larger framework of parliamentarism and federalism has become particularly activated or operative since the 1989 Lok Sabha elections, when the party system of India was transformed from one party dominance to a multi-party system. And after the advent of the multi-party system, phenomenon of coalition governments started, and the federal coalition governments are especially a federal intervention in the entire political process, and the coming into operation, coming into picture of federal coalition governments, the federal features of the Constitution have become particularly prominent. I suppose I would be taking up this theme later in the discussion. At this point, that is enough that I have already said. Now, in a holistic discussion of the Parliament at 60, we must also discuss the parliamentary process. I'm not going to discuss this in an elementary way, how a bill is passed, first reading, second reading, third reading. I'm not going into the elementary aspects. I would only highlight more significant and constitutionally relevant parts in the process. Parliamentary process consists of a number of segments of activities, and for the purpose of this discussion, we can say that there is a parliamentary process of legislation, parliamentary process of lawmaking, significantly different from lawmaking or significantly different from process of legislation is the process of constitutional amendment. Amending the Indian Constitution is a complex process. Because in any federal system, constitutional amendment is a very significant aspect. How the constitution is amended is a very significant aspect in any federal political system, because the federalism is a contractual governance. Federalism is a process of contractual or covenanted or constitutional governance, because the powers of the union and state governments are constitutionally demarcated, and their respective powers and jurisdictions and functions are specified in a constitutional contract. Now, that contract cannot be unilaterally amended or changed either by the union or by the state, and therefore the process of amendment is a very significant power in a federal political system. Some parts of the constitution can be amended by simple majority of the parliament. Some parts of the constitution can be amended by 2/3 majority in both the houses, and some parts of the constitution can be amended, particularly the federally relevant parts of the constitution that affect both orders of government, can be amended jointly, can be amended by the parliament combined with the state legislatures. If such a constitutional amendment which affects the federal structure is passed by the two houses of the parliament by 2/3 majority, 2/3 majority in the Lok Sabha, 2/3 majority in the Rajya Sabha, then the constitutional amendment bill is referred to the state legislatures, and the state legislatures ratify the amendment. And for valid constitutional amendments, at least 50% of state legislatures must ratify the amendment bill, and only with ratification by at least 50% of state legislatures, a constitutional amendment bill becomes valid. In this context, I must bring in the exercise of amendment power by the state legislatures and the process of judicial review that has come into the picture. The original constitution did not make any provision for a judicial review of constitutional amendments. The power of judicial review in the original text of the Constitution was limited to judicial review of laws and executive orders. But beginning in the 1970s, early 1970s, the Supreme Court of India has invented a new power which the original Constitution did not have. So it's a judicial, just as the power of judicial review was first invented in the United States of America by the Supreme Court of the USA in the celebrated case of Marbury versus Madison in 1806. In the year 1806, Chief Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court of America and his colleagues invented the power of judicial review, which was not there in the US Constitution. But in the process of working the Constitution, it was felt a necessity to invoke the power of judicial review, and it was an implied power. It was an implied judicial power inherent in the Constitution, though not written in so many words, explicit words, but the power was implied. Similarly, the implied power or sleeping power or sleeping judicial power or sleeping power of judicial review of constitutional amendments was constitutional amendments was first created and exercised by the Supreme Court of India in the celebrated case of Keshavananda Bharati and the state of Kerala, 1973. Now, this is a very important case in constitutional law of India, because for the first time the judiciary sat in judgment over a constitutional amendment made by the parliament or state legislatures. Before 1973, the Supreme Court of India or other constitutional courts, high courts, had never exercised this power. So, for the first time, judicial review of constitutional amendment was exercised in 1973 in Keshavananda Bharati case, and since then this power has been exercised in a number of important Supreme Court judgments, like for instance Minerva Mills judgment, Bombay judgment, Minerva Mills judgment 1980, Minerva Mills versus Union of India 1980, and S.R. Bombay versus Union of India 1994. In a number of and then a more recent case, Coelho versus the state of Tamil Nadu, 2007. In all these judgments, the power of judicial review of constitutional amendment have been exercised and institutionalized. By this time, one can say that this invented judicial doctrine, this new judicial doctrine of unamendability of the basic structure of the Constitution. What is the basis of the exercise of judicial power in this case? The basis of the judicial review of constitutional amendments is that the parliament or state legislatures have the power to amend the Constitution, but not to destroy it, not to rewrite a new Constitution. So, the Supreme Court argued that the power of amendment is a power of amendment of certain parts of the Constitution. It doesn't imply or doesn't mean altering the Constitution, changing the basic structure of Constitution beyond the limits of the vision of the makers of the Constitution or the text of the Constitution. So, the Supreme Court, there was a series of confrontation between the Parliament and the Supreme Court of India in a number of cases during the 1970s, late 1960s and 1970s. The Parliament and the Supreme Court had a series of confrontations, so to say. The Parliament amended the Constitution. Some case was filed in the Supreme Court of India against the amendment, arguing that it is unconstitutional. So, some amendments made by the Parliament were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of India, and the argument was that the power of amendment is to amend, not to destroy the Constitution or to rewrite a new Constitution. Making of a new Constitution is a constituent power. Full constituent power of making a new Constitution only belongs to a new Constituent Assembly, not to any existing Parliament. Any existing Parliament has a limited constituent power to amend, which doesn't mean to destroy the Constitution or to change the Constitution beyond recognition. So, this judicial doctrine of unamendability of the basic structure of the Constitution is a new jurisprudence which has become part and parcel of Indian constitutionalism by this time. And mind you, the Supreme Court of India so far is the only constitutional court in the world that reviews constitutional amendments. No other Supreme Court of the world, any other country, has exercised power of judicial review of constitutional amendments. Such a situation, confrontation between the Congress and the Supreme Court of America had developed in the New Deal era in the 1930s, when President Roosevelt and the Supreme Court of America came into a confrontational posture on the New Deal legislation, which were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of America. But this confrontation was contained by a number of factors. We have no time to go into them. We have no time to go into American constitutional, American constitutional history. But the point I'm trying to make is that the judicial doctrine of unamendability of the basic structure of the Constitution is a specifically Indian feature of constitutional law. Parliament works through committees. Parliament as a large body cannot function effectively and efficiently without without committees. And the parliamentary committees are the basic modes of parliamentary process or parliamentary functioning. There are ad hoc committees, including joint parliamentary committees, which are created specifically for a specific work, for a specific law, for a specific legislation, for a specific subjects. Ad hoc committees are created, which are temporary. After the work is done, the committees go into oblivion, or the committees are disbanded. But there are some standing committees which are permanent committees. These are not ad hoc committees created for a specific jobs, a specific work. Standing committees are the committees that are permanent committees of the Parliament, and there was a significant reform in the parliamentary committee system in 1993. And before that, there were omnibus standing committees that looked after a large number of subjects. But since 1993, department-based or ministry-based committees were made. All important departments or ministries, all important ministries and departments of Government of India are now, under oversight of standing committees of the Parliament. Every major ministry and department of the Government of India are, overseen or under oversight of these parliamentary committees. 21 such committees have been created that are specialized in the sense some committee would be specifically assigned to look after the work of the Ministry of Rural Development or Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Home and Ministry of Health, and so on and so forth. So this specialized committee system is a new development, and it has been appreciated by observers of the parliamentary functioning in the country. Of course, there are views that suggest that some reforms are necessary. The specialized standing committees are a good reform, but there is something more to be done about their functioning, and we would be discussing about at least some major recommendations made. For example, NCRWC report 2002, there was a constitutional commission appointed in the year 2000, National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, NCRWC, National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, and this commission, headed by Justice M.N. Venkatacharya, submitted its report in 2002. The NCRWC report has made a very significant recommendation for further reforms in the committee system of the Parliament of India. They have suggested three nodal committees. One committee on legislation, another committee on constitutional amendment, and a third committee on national economy. These three nodal permanent committees of the Parliament should be created according to NCRWC report. And these committees would function as alternative think tanks to the government. Every year, for example, the Ministry of Finance prepares a report on the state of the economy, annual economic survey. Before the budget is presented, the Finance Ministry prepares a report which is submitted to the Parliament and made public, annual economic survey. The nodal committee on national economy, if it is appointed, this reform has not yet been introduced. But if a nodal committee, as suggested by NCRWC report, is made for national economy, there we would have two alternative economic surveys. One economic survey, annual economic survey prepared by the Finance Ministry, Government of India. Another report, another annual economic survey would be prepared by a parliamentary committee. So there would be a parliamentary annual economic survey, and there would be an administrative or ministerial annual economic survey. And the alternative vision would only contribute to the improvement of governance in the country. So, in my opinion as well, the three nodal committees suggested by NCRWC report 2002 should be implemented, and we should have such committees overseeing the economy of the country, one committee specializing in constitutional amendment affairs, another parliamentary committee exclusively for legislative purposes. Now, one important aspect of the process of legislation and process of amendment that I discussed earlier, one additional point I would like to make. In the process of amendment, in the process of legislation, both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha have notionally equal powers, in the sense that if a bill is passed by the Lok Sabha, it goes to the Rajya Sabha, and only after the two houses approve such a legislation, it can become a law. In case of disagreement between the two houses, suppose the Lok Sabha passes the bill and the Rajya Sabha doesn't. In case of conflict, in case of disagreement between the two houses, the Constitution has provided a joint session of the two houses. A joint session of the two houses would be convened in the central hall of the Parliament, and by majority, the matter would be decided. In the joint session, Rajya Sabha would have fewer members, and the Lok Sabha has a larger membership. So, in the joint session, the view of the Lok Sabha is likely to prevail in case of a joint session. One important point to be kept in mind is that if there is a disagreement between the two houses on a constitutional amendment bill, now I'm talking about constitutional amendment bills, not ordinary legislation, not ordinary constitutional, not ordinary legislative bill. There is a difference between legislative bill and constitutional amendment bill. In case of disagreement between the two houses on a constitutional amendment bill, the Constitution does not provide for a joint session. Now, this silence of the Constitution, the Constitution is silent about the resolution of the disagreement between the two houses on a constitutional amendment bill. By virtue of this silence of the Constitution, the Rajya Sabha gets a veto on constitutional amendment bills. If a constitutional amendment bill is passed by the Lok Sabha, it goes to the Rajya Sabha then, and the Rajya Sabha rejects it. There is no provision for a joint session of the two houses to break the deadlock, and the implied meaning is that Rajya Sabha can veto a constitutional amendment bill. This provision in the Constitution can be seen as a special power given to the Rajya Sabha in amending the Constitution, and this is a federal feature of the Constitution. In other matters, the view of the Lok Sabha is prevalent, it prevails. The Lok Sabha in a parliamentary system, the popularly elected chamber in a parliamentary system, is the center of political gravity, because it represents the people directly. But on constitutional amendment bills, the Rajya Sabha has been given a special power, implied power of rejecting or vetoing a constitutional amendment bill passed by the Lok Sabha. So this a special power of the Rajya Sabha can be seen as a federal feature of the Constitution, because the Constitution is a joint property of the Union as well as the state governments, and it cannot be unilaterally amended or altered by one order of government exclusively. And since the Rajya Sabha is part of the Union government, but it represents the state governments, so it has a greater federal legitimacy. The Lok Sabha has a greater parliamentary legitimacy as the repository of the will of the people, whereas the Rajya Sabha has some special powers by virtue of being the federal second chamber, by virtue of representing the state or states of the Indian Union. Now we come to discuss another important aspect of the working of the parliamentary system, the parliament and the party system. Now, after independence, we began with a hegemonic one-party dominant system under the aegis of the Indian National Congress. From 1950s to 1970s, we had one-party dominant system in which the Indian National Congress dominated the state governments as well as the Parliament of India. So there was a kind of hegemonic hold over the political system by one party, one national party, the Indian National Congress. From 1989 Lok Sabha elections, this party system has become transformed, and the transformation is from one party dominant system to multi-party system. But before we come to, let us move in terms of phases of this transformation. The first phase, as I said, was hegemonic one party dominant system from 1950s to the 1970s. Now, by the 1980s, a new process of party system change started. And during the 1980s, what happened in the party system was this. the parliament continued to be under Congress majority, but state legislatures during the 1980s, one after the other, passed to non-Congress governments. Non-Congress governments came to power at the state level, and throughout the 1980s, this process continued, and one state legislature after another state legislature came under the majority of non-Congress governments. So 1980s was the period when the state party systems got delinked from the national party system. In the earlier phase, there was a complete linkage, perfect linkage between the union party system or federal party system and the state party systems. But the state party systems during the 1980s got dissociated, differentiated from the national party system. At the national level, the Indian National Congress still continued to hold the majority in the parliament. But at the state levels, majority passed into non-Congress parties. So this differentiation started in the party system, and by 1989, the entire system, entire party system became transformed, and by virtue of coming into operation of multi-party system, when no single party had a majority in the Lok Sabha. No single party, neither the Indian National Congress nor the BJP, and earlier nor the Janata Dal, had the majority, single party majority to form a government. And therefore, coalition governments or minority governments became necessary. During the phase of multi-party system since 1989, it is a continuing phase, and it still appears likely to continue in the foreseeable future. Now, the multi-party system and coalition governments since 1989 have brought to fore a number of constitutional problems which need to be discussed. The Constitution of India combines parliamentary principle and federal principle in a single constitution. It's a mixed constitution. Now, the operation or working of the Indian political system, if you examine its history after independence to the present time, you find that during one party dominant system, the parliamentary features became overwhelming, parliamentary system became dominant, and federal features were subdued, federal features were subordinated. Since 1989, what has happened? We have gone to the other extreme. During one party dominant system, parliamentary features became so overwhelming, so powerful, that federal features were suppressed, even to the extent that the chief ministers were nominated by the Prime Minister of India. During one party dominant phase, particularly during the 1970s and also during the 1980s, state chief ministers were not really elected by the state legislatures. They were nominated by the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister became a repository of this federal power as well. And therefore, the parliamentary features dominated and federal features were suppressed during one party dominant system. Now we have come to the other extreme. The pendulum has swung to the other extreme, where the parliamentary features of the constitution have become suppressed and federal features have come to dominate to an extent that the parliamentary principle is violated. For example, the Constitution of India, the parliamentary constitution, parliamentary features of the Constitution of India subscribe to the principle of collective responsibility of the cabinet to the parliament, the preeminence of the prime minister in the cabinet, preeminence of the prime minister in the cabinet. The prime minister used to be the most powerful political functionary in the government of India. During the coalition phase, what has happened? The prime minister has become very mute witness to the vagaries of the working of the government. Prime Minister seems to have lost control over his own government. Prime Minister is notionally the head of the government, but the power has become so fragmented that a ministry allotted to a coalition partner. Regional parties have come to dominate the Parliament of India in the sense that national parties do not have majority to form a government, and therefore the regional parties play the decisive role, decisive balancing role in the formation or making and unmaking of coalition governments. And therefore, regional parties and some national parties as well have come to hold the system to a ransom. The Prime Minister is dictated by his own colleagues and coalition partners, not only from the Parliament in Delhi, but also from state capitals. For example, during various phases of coalitional governance, Jayalalitha from Tamil Nadu, Balasaheb Thackeray from Mumbai, or a Mamata Banerjee from Kolkata would exercise their power and exercise their whims and caprices in such a way that the coalition government, the federal coalition government, has lost its character of being a government. Instead of constitutional coalition governance, we are passing through a phase where the governance has become chaotic, governance has become, it has gone beyond the constitutional limits. The principle of collective responsibility of the cabinet to the Lok Sabha has stretched to centers of power beyond the Parliament of India. The Prime Minister has become a mute witness to what is happening in his own government, and therefore the only possible solution to bringing back a balanced constitutional governance is to reform the party system. Unless the party system of India is reformed, we are not going to see a well-balanced constitutional governance. We appear to be stuck with coalition governments. In the foreseeable future, we do not see any sign of getting out of this situation. And therefore, we have to find ways and means of regulating the coalitional governance in a constitutional way. And party system reform, therefore, to my mind, is the most important issue on the agenda of reforms in the country, political reforms in the country. I would again refer to National Commission to review the working of the Constitution, chaired by Justice M. N. Venkatacharya. The Venkatacharya Commission report 2002 has made very positive, very significant and very meaningful recommendations to reform the electoral system and the party system of the country. The recommendations of the Commission are aimed at promoting intra-party democracy, democratic constitutional making of the parties. Today, there is hardly any party that follows its own constitution. Every party has its own constitution, but it doesn't honor its constitution, and it works in a very informal, ad hoc way and personalized way. Parties are headed by caste leaders, community leaders, family control, dynastic control. These are all widely prevalent features in the party system of India. If political parties are made to work, function democratically, it was expected in the Constituent Assembly of India. The Assembly was, the makers of the Constitution were not worried about the health of the party system. If you read the Constituent Assembly debates, the anxiety is about how the administration will work, how the parliamentary institutions will work, but there is no anxiety evident in the makers of the Constitution about the party system. Probably they thought that as the party system has developed in the Western liberal democracies outside the framework of government, because party system is it is part of the civil society. In a democratic polity, party system is more a part of the civil society than the government. It's a vital link between the government and the people, and the government and the opposition become parts of the parliament and parts of the political system. But basically, political parties are meant to link the civil society with the state. And political parties in India are failing in this important function. And it is in this context that the NCRWC report has recommended a comprehensive legislation, a comprehensive law to be enacted to regulate the working of the party system. And this law will require political parties to hold annual or biannual internal elections for every party, for the office holders of the party. So regular elections working according to the law regulating the political parties, and the comprehensive law would require not only democratic functioning of the parties, it will also require transparent and publicly audited funds to the parties. Party funding or the party finances is a murky area in the working of the Indian political system. We do not have much transparency about the sources of funds or sources of funds that come to the political parties. And the comprehensive law that is recommended would require political parties to maintain accounts, and these accounts would be publicly audited. So this is a very significant recommendation which will bring about reforms in the party system that would be conducive to a proper working of the parliamentary federal system in the country. Now, let me draw your attention to another theme, the parliament in the era of neoliberal reforms. The Indian political economy underwent a very significant change in the year 1991 when the Rao Congress minority government introduced a package of neoliberal reforms, and the previously state control a state-dominated economy, public sector dominated economy was partly privatized, and economic liberalization, bureaucratic deregulation, and opening of the economy to foreign investors. This is a very important economic reform that has transformed the political economy of the country. In this context, the parliament, the role of the parliament becomes very important, because in the Indian socialism era, we had a bureaucratic state. We had a strong bureaucratic apparatus that regulated, directly controlled administration, directly controlled the economy as well. Since the neoliberal economic reforms, economy has been bureaucratically deregulated, and in case of direct bureaucratic control of the economy, we have introduced a series of reforms in the form of parliamentary acts establishing independent regulatory commissions. Independent regulatory commissions have been set up under various parliamentary acts. For instance, such independent regulatory commissions exist in the electricity sector, in the telecom sector, in the coal sector, in the companies sector. A plethora of independent regulatory commissions have been created under parliamentary acts since 1991. And in place of directly bureaucratically controlled, direct bureaucratic control of the economy, we have now indirect regulation through these independent regulatory authorities. Now, these commissions are accountable to the parliament. They are supposed to submit an annual report to the parliament, and their accountability is to the Parliament of India, and therefore the Parliament of India has become very significant. It has a significant role. Earlier, it was the ministry and the bureaucracy that had direct control of the economy. Now, the indirect control of the economy through independent regulatory commissions is a new feature, and the Parliament's role, since they are accountable to the Parliament, Parliament's role has become very important. We had such commissions. Few such commissions existed right from the beginning. Like for instance, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. This office has been part and parcel of Indian governance right from the commencement of the Constitution. And the CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General of India, reports to the Parliament, and its reports to the Parliament have brought about very significant issues relating to the working of the economy, relating to the working of the government, relating to the accounts of the union government and the state governments. The CAG has authority, accounting, it's an accounting agency, accounting authority for the union as well as the state governments. This is again a new feature of Indian Constitution. In other federal systems, such offices exist separately for the two orders of government. But the Constitution of India has created a joint CAG for accounts, for auditing accounts of the union as well as state governments. And the Parliament has become a very important focus, very important agency to which these independent regulatory authorities report. Now, the Parliament and the mass media is another theme which needs to be discussed in this context. The mass media is in fact an alternative parliament, one can say. They are often described as the fourth estate The mass media is often described as the fourth state. The three states in European countries, in European parliamentary institutions were there. For instance, the noble, the clergy, and the commons. The media, when it emerged, was called the fourth estate, and therefore the mass media is a very important democratic agency, and it's part of the civil society. In India, the print media and electronic media have developed enormously, and particularly since 1990s, there has been a burgeoning of the mass media, both in the print sector as well as in the electronic sector. And the regulatory agencies for the print media is the Press Council of India. Press Council of India is created under an Act of Parliament, and it regulates the print media. And the Parliament of India has also enacted the Prasar Bharati Corporation Act, and this corporation, this autonomous corporation, regulates the electronic media. The parliamentary committees should, as a matter of principle, give access to the media, and the parliament and the media together should have some linkage, should have some cooperative working. And the print media often feels that print media, or the mass media as a whole, not only print media, feels that the government doesn't interact significantly or doesn't provide access to the media. In a parliamentary democracy, in a participatory parliamentary democracy, the media becomes an alternative participatory media, parliamentary alternative participatory mechanism for the people. And therefore, the relationship between the parliament and mass media needs to be looked into, and particularly in the post-liberalization phase of Indian political system, the proper relationship or the proper role of the mass media needs to be looked into and regulated. Finally, since the time is how many? 2 minutes. I will very briefly conclude my lecture with a discussion of Parliament and the people. In recent times, in the last few years particularly, we have seen a face-off between the civil society and the Parliament, and the parliamentarians have reacted to certain civil society movements, particularly anti-corruption movements, in a way that appears high-handed. Parliamentarians have tried to assert a supremacy or assert a kind of privilege that is undemocratic. At times it appears that the Parliament has behaved in a way that would appear to be seeking a special privileges. Now, this kind of face-off between the Parliament and the civil society is unfortunate, and we should remember that the Indian Constitution begins with the ringing declaration of popular sovereignty. The principle of popular sovereignty is expressed in the preamble, opening lines of the preamble, where we, the people of India, are declared to be the source of all political power. So this should not be forgotten. But I must point out that after the preamble, the rest of the Constitution devotes its attention to the institutions of government, and the idea of referendum was not given a place in the Constitution. There were proposals in the Constituent Assembly to institute referendum for certain purposes, the kind of referendums that are part and parcel of governance in Switzerland, partly in the USA, partly in Australia, partly in Sri Lanka. But referendum was not given any quarters in the Constitution when it was made. And under laws also referendum do not find a place. But in some recent laws relating to ecology and environment, people's participation is emphasized, and views of the people are required to be ascertained by the local administration for giving ecological clearance to industrial or governmental projects. So the point on which I would like to conclude is that in our system of parliamentary federal governance, the authority of the institutions of government must be dovetailed with the popular sovereignty, which is also part and parcel of the Constitution via the preamble. And the heritage of political culture, from the freedom movement, the Gandhian heritage of mass movements is part and parcel of Indian political culture. It is not part of the Constitution, but it is an integral part of Indian political culture, where non-violent mass action, satyagrah, has become part of the belief system of Indians. And therefore, in a proper system of parliamentary federal governance, all these features have to be reconciled in a constitutional way. I would conclude on this point.
So, well, friends, in 2 lectures, I got familiar with the major areas of parliamentary system, major domains where you can have further study, and you also got acquainted with various aspects that help you to know how the Parliament of India or the parliamentary system has been working and been successful over the years. So certainly I hope this lecture have helped you, given insight, and will open you an area where you can do a further study and you can enrich the knowledge system of parliamentary democracy. So with this, we conclude the lecture, and I thank all of you for watching this program, and on your behalf, I thank Professor M.P. Singh for giving such an insightful lecture on this very topic. Thank you very much.